Love can be the sweetest bond, or the cruelest trap. 3 years ago they married as strangers, bound by a contract, not by love. They walked away, certain they'd never cross paths again. But fate had other plans. He fell for a woman he believed was someone new. She longed for a man she thought she could never have. Neither knew. They were already husband and wife. This isn't just a love story. It's a tale of fate's cruel games, of hearts torn between truth and desire, and the shocking moment when love comes face to face with the past. Sit back and let the story unfold. The sky over Seoul was pale and cold that morning, the kind of grey that made the city feel distant and unwelcoming. Thalia walked slowly toward the district office, her steps heavy as if the weight of her decision clung to her ankles. The glass doors reflected her face, a young woman far from home, caught between fear and determination. She stopped just outside the entrance, her breath clouding the chilly air. For a moment she couldn't move. Tears stung her eyes before she could stop them, slipping down her cheeks in silent defiance. She had heard of contract marriages before, stories whispered among struggling foreign students, tales of quick money, paperwork and regret. She never imagined she would be one of them. But here she was, standing on the edge of a choice that felt both humiliating and necessary. Architecture had always been her dream, the reason she had come to this country in the first place. She wanted to design buildings that could outlast her own life, yet dreams cost money, and her scholarship had run dry. Rent was overdue, tuition loomed, and her family back home could not help her. If this was what it took to stay in school, to hold on to her future, then she would do it. Even if it meant marrying a man whose face she had never seen. She wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, drew in a shaky breath, and stepped inside. The district office was sterile and quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small sound, a pen clicking, papers shuffling, feel loud. The clerk behind the desk barely looked up as she and the officer in charge of the paperwork sat waiting. Minutes stretched into an hour. The chair beneath her felt harder with every passing second. The district officer glanced at the empty space beside her, then at the clock on the wall. His voice broke the silence. "Isn't he supposed to be here by now? Where is he?" Thalia swallowed, her throat dry. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. He was supposed to be here by now, maybe." She hesitated, the thought painful to admit. Maybe he changed his mind. The words tasted bitter, like failure. She lowered her gaze, trying to keep herself composed, but her fingers wouldn't stay still. Her eyes burned again, and as she reached up to wipe the tears, her spectacles slipped off her face. The thin metal frame clattered softly against the tiled floor. Her vision blurred into a wash of colors and shapes. Panic rushed through her chest as she dropped to her knees, fumbling across the floor with her fingertips trying to find the glasses. At that exact moment, the door to the office opened. A tall figure stepped inside. The sound of the door closing behind him seemed to echo in the quiet room. The sound of the door swinging shut startled Thalia as she crouched on the floor, her fingers still brushing blindly over the cold tiles. A man's footsteps crossed the room, steady and unhurried. He didn't pause to help. He didn't even look down at her. His voice, low and clipped, broke the silence. "Let's get this over with as soon as possible." The words were flat, detached, as if he were discussing a business transaction rather than a marriage. Thalia froze for a second, her heart tightening. That was the first time she heard the voice of the man who was about to become her husband, and it carried no trace of warmth. The district officer cleared his throat and gestured toward the counter. "Please sign here," he said, sliding the papers across for the man's signature. Thalia finally felt the small plastic edge of her contact lens beneath her fingertips. Relief washed over her as she quickly cleaned it with trembling hands and placed it back into her eye. She stood up, blinking to steady her vision, but by the time her sight cleared enough to make out shapes, the man had already turned away. All she caught was his back as he moved toward the exit, his posture straight, his face never revealed. It was as if he had come here only to leave. The district officer, who had grown used to strange cases like this, glanced at her and tried to fill the silence. "So, you are officially married to Hamin," Oh, don't worry, Thalia interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. I don't want to know his name. She kept her gaze fixed on the papers in front of her. If the man didn't care enough to so much as look at her face or offer a hand when she was struggling on the floor, why should she care who he was? Without another word, she signed her part of the contract. The pen felt heavy in her fingers. With each stroke of ink, the weight of her choice pressed deeper into her chest. The moment the papers were stamped and filed away, she turned on her heel and walked out of the office, her steps brisk, her head slightly bowed. The air outside felt colder than when she arrived. For a moment she stood there at the bottom of the stone steps, staring at the busy street ahead, the cars rushing by, the strangers brushing past her, as if her life hadn't just changed in the space of a few minutes. She drew in a long breath, forcing herself to stand taller. This was not the future she had once imagined. No white dress, no smiling faces, no vows of love. But the deal was done, and it gave her what she needed most, the means to stay in school. This is not about him, she told herself as she stepped onto the sidewalk. This is about my dream. I will make the most of this chance. I will not waste it. Her heart still felt heavy, but as she walked away from the district office, she fixed her mind on her studies, on her future as an architect. She would endure this strange, hollow marriage if it meant keeping her dream alive. 3 years had passed since that cold morning at the district office. Seoul had changed in that time. Taller buildings, brighter billboards, faster cars. But so had Thalia. The young woman who once signed a marriage contract out of desperation now walked with measured confidence, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor of Transient's headquarters, the largest real estate and construction company in South Korea. She adjusted the strap of her work bag on her shoulder as she strode down the wide hallway lined with glass walls and modern art. This was her first day back in South Korea after years away, and although the air inside the building was cool and professional, her heart carried a strange mix of nerves and quiet determination. Thalia. The cheerful voice cut through the ambient hum of distant conversations and ringing phones. Thalia turned and broke into a genuine smile when she saw Amabel hurrying toward her. Amabel had been her closest friend during their college years, the one person who had stood by her during the most difficult days. When Thalia had called to say she was coming back to South Korea for a while, it was Amabel who had helped her secure this job at Transient. They met halfway, hugging warmly in the middle of the hallway, drawing a few glances from passing employees. "Thank you so much for helping me get this job, Amabel," Thalia said, her voice soft but sincere. "Oh, come on," Amabel replied with a playful wave of her hand. Her eyes sparkled. "When I heard you were coming back, I was so happy. I've missed you so much." They began walking together, falling into easy conversation, their footsteps echoing off the polished floor. As they turned a corner, the atmosphere around them shifted. A subtle hush moved through the employees nearby. A man was walking toward them, tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit. There was something about the way he carried himself, an unspoken authority that made people straighten slightly as he passed. Thalia slowed unconsciously, her eyes drawn to him. His face was calm, his gaze focused straight ahead. Even in the brief moment as he walked past, the air around him seemed to bend to his presence, as if the building itself acknowledged who he was. "That's Hamin Park," Amabel whispered beside her, breaking Thalia's momentary stillness with a soft giggle. "The CEO, technically, your boss." Thalia blinked, tearing her gaze away as a faint, almost embarrassed smile crossed her lips. Amabel wasn't done. Her tone turned conspiratorial as they continued down the hall. "He's one of South Korea's youngest CEOs, a self-made millionaire, and trust me, a lot of girls here would give anything to get his attention." Thalia shook her head, trying to brush off the remark. "Amabel, I'm married," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Amabel gave her a knowing look and laughed lightly. "To a man you barely know, that contract is the only thing keeping you tied. Don't tell me you're still holding on to that as if it's real." Thalia's smile faded slightly. Only Amabel knew the truth about her contract marriage, about the faceless man she had legally tied herself to, the one she had never truly met. "That's why I'm here," Thalia said quietly, her eyes fixed ahead, "to finally put an end to it." Amabel glanced at her, slightly surprised. "Really? You're going to end it?" Thalia nodded. "Yes, it's time." Amabel tilted her head, studying her friend. There was a note of relief in her voice as she finally replied, "Well, it's about time you moved on. You deserve to find some real love in your life." What Amabel didn't know was that Thalia herself had no clear picture of the man she had married. She had only ever known his first name, Hamin, and had dealt exclusively with his lawyer. For years, he had been nothing more than a signature on papers and a distant name in legal documents. Hamin Park had built Transient into an empire through sheer discipline and relentless drive. In the world of real estate and construction, where fortunes often rose and fell on a single deal, he was known for his sharp instincts and unshakable focus. To his staff, he was both a visionary and a storm. He demanded perfection, never tolerating excuses. For those who worked directly under him, the pressure was constant, like standing in the path of a steady wind that never let up. His personal architect, the one who had accompanied him to project sites and translated his bold concepts into reality, had recently quit, unable to keep pace with his exacting standards. The departure had left a vacuum that needed to be filled quickly. Hamin, however, was done working with experienced professionals who arrived with their egos intact, unwilling to listen to someone younger than themselves. Too often they mistook his demands for arrogance. That morning, in his glass-walled office overlooking the city, he turned to Sion, his trusted confidant and right-hand man. "Enough with these so-called experts," he said, his tone as even and cool as ever. "Find someone fresh, someone willing to learn. Pull the new junior architects. I'll choose from them myself." By afternoon, the news had spread across the open-plan floor where the junior staff worked. The position was temporary but coveted. Whoever got it would be working closely with the CEO himself. Among the eligible juniors, there were only two names, Thalia and Lucina. The announcement had barely been made when Lucina, a stylish young woman known for her sharp tongue and ambition, turned her attention to Thalia. Leaning against her desk with an air of casual cruelty, Lucina smirked. "You shouldn't even bother applying," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for others to hear. "There's no way the CEO will pick a black girl over me, not when I can—" She trailed off, making a suggestive gesture with a sly grin that left little doubt about her meaning. Thalia froze at her workstation, stunned by the unprovoked remark. She had met Lucina only days ago, and couldn't understand why she had become the target of such open hostility. Her first instinct was to defend herself, to speak up, but the words never came. Instead, she lowered her gaze and focused on the file in front of her, her silence a fragile shield against the sting of Lucina's mockery. When the time came for the interview, both candidates were summoned to Hamin's private office. The space was minimalist yet imposing, with clean lines of steel and glass that reflected the man who ruled over it. Hamin sat behind his desk, scanning their files with an unreadable expression. He looked first at Lucina, then at Thalia. For a moment his gaze lingered on Thalia. Something in her posture, the way she held herself steady yet unpretentious, caught his attention. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made even simple questions feel significant. "Thalia," she answered, her tone polite but firm, her eyes meeting his for just an instant before lowering respectfully. Hamin's pen stilled over the paper. Thalia. The name struck him like a note played on an old instrument he hadn't touched in years. It was the name of the woman he had married in a cold, detached transaction 3 years ago, the woman he had never truly met. His gaze deepened, studying her face. Could it be her? The thought flickered through his mind but was quickly brushed aside. Seoul was a vast city, names repeated. The chances were slim. He returned to his composed exterior, yet somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet unease stirred. The interview room fell into an awkward silence the moment Lucina leaned forward across the desk. She shifted in her seat with a practiced tilt of her shoulders, her posture suggestive rather than professional. Every glance, every slow movement of her hand as she brushed her hair aside was calculated. A silent promise that she could offer the CEO more than architectural skill. Hamin's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The faintest trace of disgust flickered across his face. He had encountered such tactics before, young professionals who mistook proximity to power for an invitation. He despised it. His voice, when he spoke, was clipped and cold. The person I hire will not only handle architectural duties, but will also double as my personal assistant. The work is demanding. I will not have anyone who cannot keep up, regardless of what else they think they can offer. The words hung in the air like a wall slamming shut. He turned his gaze back to Thalia. There was something about her stillness, the way she sat quietly, hands folded on her lap. She didn't try to impress him with charm. She didn't scramble to fill the silence. She was calm, composed, and somehow she felt familiar. His decision came quickly. "Thalia, you'll take the position," he said at last. Lucina's lips parted in disbelief. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but stopped when Hamin's eyes shifted to her, colder than before. "And a warning," he said sharply. "Do not bring that behavior into my office again. Not with me. Not with anyone. Consider this your first and last caution." Lucina's face flushed crimson. She clenched her fists at her sides as she rose from the chair, barely managing to keep her composure as she stormed out. In her mind, she was already plotting. How could he pick her? A newcomer. Humiliation burned hot in her chest, twisting into something darker, a promise that she would find a way to sabotage Thalia as long as they worked under the same roof. Inside the room, the tension eased as the door closed behind Lucina. Hamin leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes lingering on Thalia for a moment longer than necessary. "You look like someone I've met before," he said, his tone softer, almost curious. Thalia blinked, caught off guard by the comment. She had no idea what to say, so she simply remained silent, her gaze lowering politely. Hamin shifted as if dismissing the thought for now. "I'll be honest," he continued, "this position demands a lot. I'll need someone I can trust, not just with schedules and plans, but with personal matters as well. Can I trust you?" Thalia nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, sir." For a brief second their eyes met, and though neither said it aloud, there was a flicker of something unspoken between them. "Good," he said, reaching for a notepad. "I'll need you to handle a few arrangements. I have an important personal meeting coming up. I want you to book reservations. Somewhere quiet, discreet, elegant." Thalia jotted down the note, her expression neutral though curiosity stirred inside her. He paused for a moment, then asked a question she hadn't expected. "As a woman, if you hadn't seen your husband for a long time, and you were about to meet him again, what kind of gift would you expect him to bring to make you happy?" The question hung in the air, drawing her eyes up to meet his again. Thalia hesitated before answering. She hadn't expected a question like that from him. Based on the stories she'd heard around the company, that Hamin Park was cold, harsh, almost unapproachable, she'd braced herself for clipped instructions and perhaps a few cutting remarks. But instead here he was asking about something personal, thoughtful even. She took a small breath before speaking. "Well, if you haven't seen her for such a long time," she said carefully, "I think she'd care more about your attention, about you actually spending time with her, listening to her. That means more than any expensive gift. But a gesture always helps. You could bring her favorite flowers." For a moment, silence filled the office. Hamin sat back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her as if weighing her words. There was something about the way she said it, the calm sincerity, the unadorned truth in her voice, that stirred an uneasy thought in his mind. "She sounds too much like..." He cut the thought off before it could take shape. He didn't want to go down that road. The truth was, he didn't even know what kind of flowers his contract wife liked. He thought back to that day 3 years ago, the rushed signatures, his curt words, how he'd walked away without even glancing at her face. For the first time, he regretted it. How did she feel that day? Did she think I was heartless? He looked back at Thalia, almost searching her expression for something he couldn't name. "What about you?" he asked quietly. "What flowers do you like?" Thalia blinked, caught off guard again, but she answered. He nodded slowly and made a decision. He would use her choice as the guide. Somehow it felt right. Then, as if the brief personal moment had never happened, he shifted back to business. "These are the architectural projects you'll handle for the week," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork, but Thalia carried a quiet unease with her. She couldn't quite reconcile the stories she'd heard about the CEO with the man she'd met in that office. Hamin had arrived early, half an hour before the agreed time. Punctuality was his habit, but tonight it was more than that. He was determined to start over, to meet his long-absent contract wife with an open mind. He sat by the window of the Sky Tower restaurant, the city lights glittering like a river of stars beneath them. He was rehearsing in his head what he would say, how to bridge 3 years of silence, when he looked up. A woman was walking toward the entrance, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. She wasn't just beautiful. There was a quiet poise about her. Her simple, elegant dress caught the soft glow of the chandeliers, tracing the line of her figure. Her skin was luminous against the warm light, and the confident but slightly hesitant way she moved drew his eyes and held them there. His surprise deepened when he recognized her. Thalia, his new junior architect, his temporary assistant. But what was she doing here in the same restaurant where he was waiting for his wife? Across the room, Thalia froze as soon as she saw him. Her heart skipped. Of all the people she could run into tonight, it had to be her boss. For a second, she wondered if fate was mocking her. Collecting herself, she walked toward his table with a polite smile, her steps measured though her thoughts raced. She leaned slightly forward so her voice wouldn't carry. "I didn't expect to see you here, sir," she said quickly. "I actually have a meeting here tonight. I'm sorry if it looks odd." Hamin tilted his head, curiosity flickering across his face. "I didn't know you were married," he said, his tone calm but edged with something unspoken. Thalia straightened, hiding the small twist in her chest. "It's complicated. I haven't seen my husband in quite some time. I should wait at my table," she replied, managing a small, composed smile before excusing herself. He watched her as she walked away. The way the light slid over her hair, the steadiness in her posture. Something about her tugged at the edge of a memory he couldn't quite place. If only my wife is even half as graceful as she is, he thought, then forced the thought aside. Neither of them knew the truth, that they were here for each other. Time stretched. Half an hour passed. The clock on the wall ticked on, and the seat across from Hamin remained empty. A knot of frustration tightened in his chest. "I came here to make amends." She couldn't even show up. His eyes drifted across the room again, drawn inevitably to Thalia. She sat quietly at her own table, her fingers curling around the rim of her water glass. There was the faintest shadow in her eyes, the kind you notice only if you're watching closely. What kind of man would keep a woman like her waiting? Hamin thought, his jaw tightening. Finally, with a quiet breath and a decision made, he pushed back his chair. If they were both being stood up, there was no point in sitting alone. Thalia had been staring absently at the art on her table, wondering how long she would keep waiting, when she noticed movement in the corner of her eye. She looked up, and almost froze again. Hamin was walking toward her table. There was no sign of the usual controlled sternness in his expression. Instead, his face carried a faint, wry smile. He stopped in front of her table, tilted his head slightly, and without asking, pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Seems like your date bailed on you too," he said lightly, as if they were two strangers sharing the same misfortune. For a moment, Thalia just blinked at him, then let out a small, nervous laugh. "Looks that way," she admitted. What began as an awkward exchange between a CEO and his substitute assistant slowly turned into real conversation. They started with the obvious, their absent partners, offering each other half-serious tips about how to handle stubborn spouses. But soon the talk shifted. He asked about her college days in South Korea. She told him about her struggles when she first arrived, her love for architecture, her fondness for small cafes in quiet streets. In turn, he shared stories of his early years running the company, of the sleepless nights spent at construction sites, of how discipline had shaped him but also made him feel isolated. Somewhere between their shared stories, the stiffness faded. At one point, Hamin made a dry, understated joke about how the restaurant's fancy meal tasted like cardboard. Thalia laughed harder than she expected, almost choking on a bite of food. That set him off too, and soon they were both laughing, freely, unguarded, drawing curious glances from a nearby table. Their laughter tapered into a comfortable silence, the kind that only happens when two people fall into the same rhythm without meaning to. Anyone watching them from afar would have assumed they were a couple on a date. By the end of the evening, the air between them had changed. There was no denying it. Something had shifted. Hamin could feel the pull of that connection. It unsettled him, yet he didn't want it to end. He leaned back slightly, studying her across the table. "Why would anybody keep someone like you waiting?" he asked quietly. The words lingered in the space between them. Thalia felt the weight of them. For a brief, dangerous second, she wanted to tell him everything, about the contract marriage, about the cold, faceless man who had stayed away for 3 long years, about how that chapter of her life was finally coming to an end. She even wanted to tell him the strange coincidence of the name, how her absent husband was also named Hamin, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she smiled faintly, tilting her head as if to deflect the question. "Any woman would be proud to have a man like you," she said softly. "Maybe. You should try a little harder. Don't just set dates. Visit her. Make her feel you mean it." Hamin listened, but for a moment he didn't answer. He reached down beside his chair and brought up the bouquet he had brought for his wife, the bouquet Thalia herself had chosen earlier that day. He held it out to her. "If she didn't show up," he said, his voice softer than before, "then these shouldn't go to waste. They suit you better anyway." Thalia hesitated, then accepted the flowers, her fingers brushing lightly against his. For the briefest moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you," she said finally. Hamin gave a small smile, his eyes lingering on her in a way that felt both admiring and unspoken. "You look beautiful tonight," he said. "And you have one of the most pleasant personalities I've ever met." Thalia lowered her gaze, her smile lingering but tinged with something she couldn't quite name. Across the table, the distance between them felt smaller than it had at the start of the evening. After dinner, the warmth of their laughter lingered, but reality soon crept back in. Hamin kept glancing at his phone as they sat there, as if willing a message to appear. The screen stayed dark. The longer it stayed silent, the more his face tightened. Thalia noticed. She could see the weight pressing on his shoulders, the guilt, the regret. He set his phone down with a soft sigh and leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I know I messed up," he admitted quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I didn't treat her right from the start. I keep thinking, what if it's too late now? I don't even know what to do." Thalia's gaze softened. "If it were me," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I wouldn't want apologies from far away. I'd want you to show me that I mattered. Don't wait around for her to come to you. Don't just give her options. Go to her. Make it impossible for her to ignore you. Show her you mean it." Her words came out gently, but there was an edge of sincerity in them that made Hamin look at her differently. "You put so much effort into this," she added, her voice quiet but steady. "If I were her, I'd be grateful. Maybe the problem is that she hasn't seen your efforts. Don't wait for her to show up. Go to her and let her see it." A faint, wistful smile crossed her face, and she added, almost as an afterthought, "Unlike me. The person I was supposed to meet tonight didn't even care enough to call and cancel. So, just go. Show her." Hamin's eyes lingered on her, his expression softening in a way that made her look away. For a fleeting moment he wished, silently, almost guiltily, that he was dealing with Thalia instead. She spoke with warmth, with understanding, in a way he hadn't felt in years. He broke the silence with a faint smile. "Thank you," he said simply. When the evening finally drew to a close, he offered to drive her home. She declined with a polite shake of her head, insisting she would take a cab. As she stepped out into the cool night air, bouquet in hand, Thalia felt a strange mix of emotions. She was surprised by the unexpected ease she had found with her boss that night, the laughter, the quiet moments, but the hollow ache remained. The man she had come there to meet had not even cared enough to call. Hamin watched her leave, his heart weighed down by a similar conflict. The evening had been unexpectedly warm, even comforting, yet he couldn't shake the bitterness of being stood up by the one person he had hoped to make amends with. For both of them, the night had unfolded in ways they hadn't anticipated. And yet, as they each went their separate ways, they couldn't deny that something subtle had shifted between them. Something neither of them could quite explain. That night, after getting home, Thalia wasted no time. She called Rian, the lawyer who had handled the contract marriage from the beginning. Her voice trembled, not with sadness, but with quiet anger. "I was there," she said curtly. "Your client abandoned me at the restaurant. I don't want to hear another excuse. We are finalizing the divorce. I'm done." Ryan sat at his desk, staring at his phone long after the call ended. Abandoned her. Those were almost the exact words Hamin had used earlier when he explained that his wife never showed up. Ryan frowned, drumming his fingers against the table. "So who's lying?" he muttered under his breath. Or did they somehow go to different places? He considered asking Hamin for clarification, but something told him to let it go. For now. Meanwhile, Hamin had made up his mind. He kept thinking about Thalia's advice from that night at the restaurant. Her words echoed in his mind, "Don't give her an excuse not to see you. Just go to her." For the first time in 3 years, he decided to do exactly that. The next day, he called Ryan and requested his wife's address. Ryan, unaware that Thalia had moved just one building over from her old apartment, sent Hamin the only address he had on record, the one Thalia had given him 3 years earlier. That evening, as dusk settled over the city, Hamin arrived at the old building. He stood in the hallway outside the apartment door, a bouquet of fresh flowers in his hand. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the door as if it held all the answers to his regrets. He thought about the advice she had given him, how he had to prove he cared. No more waiting, no more excuses. Drawing a steady breath, he knocked. A moment later, the door opened, and Hamin found himself staring into the eyes of a strikingly beautiful black American woman. She looked at him quizzically, but before Hamin could say a word, a tall, broad-shouldered man appeared behind her. The man was shirtless, wearing only a pair of shorts, and he eyed Hamin with sharp suspicion. "Can I help you?" the man asked flatly. For a second, Hamin's thoughts scrambled. This wasn't the face he had expected. His mind went blank. He felt foolish, almost as if the weight of 3 years had led him to the wrong door. Without saying a word, he turned, walked down the hallway, and left the building. On his way out, he tossed the bouquet into a nearby garbage bin. As he drove away, his expression hardened. At least now he thought it wouldn't be on his conscience that he hadn't tried. And if his contract wife truly didn't care enough to meet him halfway, then he wouldn't feel guilty about denying her any of the remaining benefits from the contract. As Hamin stepped out of the building and headed toward his car, he slowed. A familiar figure caught his eye. Thalia was across the courtyard, struggling to adjust a grocery bag on her arm as she reached for the entrance of the next building. For a moment he simply watched her, surprised, then quietly pleased. A smile touched his face as he called out, his voice carrying a note of warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. "I didn't know you lived around here." Thalia paused, turned, and her expression softened when she saw him. She explained that she had lived in the building he had just stepped out of for more than 3 years before leaving South Korea. But when she returned, there had been no vacant apartments. She had to settle for the building next door. Hamin nodded, a small chuckle escaping his lips at the coincidence. "What about you? What are you doing here?" she asked. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then replied with a faint shrug. "I was taking your advice. But apparently my wife has already moved on. She's with someone else." His tone carried no bitterness, just quiet acceptance. Thalia's chest tightened at the thought. She felt she should at least offer him some kindness, some warmth. "You should come over," she said gently. "I made something nice. Consider it my treat." Hamin didn't protest. He followed her up to her apartment, a little unsure but strangely at ease. Inside, the air smelled faintly of spices and home-cooked warmth. Thalia moved easily around the small kitchen, plating a dish with practiced care. "This is one of my specialties," she said, with a playful smile as she set it before him. Hamin took his first bite and let out a soft, satisfied sigh. "It's really good," he murmured. The meal turned into something more than just food. As they talked, laughter slipped into the quiet apartment. Every so often, Hamin's eyes lingered on her, longer than he intended. He noticed the soft glow of her skin under the warm light, the natural curve of her smile, the way her eyes brightened whenever she teased him. He noticed her figure, graceful and effortless, and he forced himself to look away. When he saw a tiny crumb caught on the corner of her lip, his hand moved before he could think. He leaned in slightly, brushed it away with his thumb, just a simple, fleeting gesture. But as he pulled his hand back, he caught himself staring at her lips for a heartbeat too long. Thalia didn't say anything, and neither did he. The evening stretched on. The conversation flowed as if they'd known each other for years. Time slipped past unnoticed, until Hamin glanced at the window and saw the dark curtain of night had fallen over the city. He hadn't felt this free, this light, in years. For the first time in so long, he laughed without a shadow behind it. He didn't want the night to end, but as he rose to leave, a quiet reminder echoed in the back of his mind. Thalia was still married, trying, as she had said, to fix what was broken, and that was a line he dared not cross. On the drive back, the night outside his windshield blurred into a string of city lights. But Hamin's mind wasn't on the road. It was burning, not with regret about his estranged wife, but with the memory of his contract wife. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The more he thought about her, the more the anger built, slow, controlled, but heavy enough to settle in his chest. At a red light, he snatched up his phone and called Rian. The words came out cold, stripped of any softness. "Tell Thalia I'm done playing nice. She shouldn't expect anything from me. What I needed her for 3 years ago is over. If she's moved on with someone else, she gets nothing, not a dime." When Rian met up with Thalia later that day, he delivered the message almost word for word. The moment the words "new lover" left his lips, she blinked, stunned. "New lover?" she repeated under her breath. Her mind raced. Did Hamin see her with someone? Was he talking about the night she had dinner with her boss? The idea felt absurd, but it planted a splinter of doubt. She pushed it aside quickly, straightening her shoulders. Her voice sharpened as she faced Rian. "I'm not taking any of that," she said. "After everything I've done to meet him halfway, even forcing myself to go on that ridiculous date he suggested, only for him to abandon me at the restaurant?" Her eyes flashed with a mix of hurt and defiance. "If he wants to play it that way," she continued, her tone turning cold, "then fine. I don't want the divorce either. Let's stay married and keep each other trapped. If I can't move on, then neither will he." She turned and walked away, her words hanging in the air like a final challenge. At the office the next morning, Rian relayed her response to Hamin. The anger that had been simmering all night finally cracked. Hamin's jaw tightened, the pen in his hand stilled against the paper. He could still see her in his mind, standing there, calm and composed, as if she had done nothing wrong, as if she hadn't pretended not to know him that day, as if she were the one wronged. "She acts innocent," he muttered under his breath, a hard edge creeping into his voice. "But I saw her with someone else. I saw it with my own eyes." The thought of her indifference, her denial, gnawed at him more than anything else. For the first time in years, the usually self-controlled man felt something raw stir beneath the surface. a frustration he couldn't easily shake. The whispers started small, just murmurs passed in the break room, in the corners of hallways. But soon they grew sharp enough to follow Thalia wherever she went. They said she was sleeping with the boss, that it was the real reason she was getting noticed, that the promotions, the perks, the praise weren't from her talent, but from late-night favors. When Amabel, Thalia's closest friend at the office, finally traced the rumor back, she wasn't surprised. It was Lucina. Lucina had never forgiven Thalia for landing the role she had fought for, nor for being so quickly noticed by the CEO. Jealousy burned brighter than reason, and now she had found a way to poison Thalia's image. Thalia didn't let the gossip fester. She confronted Lucina one afternoon, cornering her near the office pantry. Lucina didn't flinch. In fact, she smirked, her voice low but cutting. "Oh, please," she said. "I know about the late-night dinners, the sleepovers. We all know you're just clawing your way up the ladder, but here's the fun part." She leaned closer, her tone turning almost gleeful. "Word is, the man you're so eager to impress is married. So, you might want to brace yourself, because I'll make sure his wife finds out." For a heartbeat, the air between them felt charged, like a storm about to break. Thalia didn't respond. She just looked at Lucina, long enough to read the envy behind her smug smile, and then turned and walked away, her steps calm but her decision made. It's jealousy, nothing more. She told herself that, over and over, until the sting of the accusation dulled. A few weeks later, Transient prepared for its most important event of the year, the annual International Housing Conference. It was a big deal. Dozens of global companies would attend, bringing with them the chance for lucrative partnerships and new alliances. Sion, meticulous and strategic, was determined that everything would be flawless, and when it came to who would represent the company on stage, his choice was decisive. "Thalia," he said. Her dedication, her poise, her ability to command a room. He had noticed it all. She would be the host. She would present the company's work to the world. The announcement landed like a stone in a still pond. The ripples of discontent spread across the office. Some saw it as fair recognition. Others muttered about favoritism. Lucina, especially, felt the old bitterness clawing at her chest. Once again, Thalia had been given the spotlight, and the thought of watching her shine on that stage was almost unbearable. The conference hall glowed beneath a canopy of soft golden lights, the kind that made glass chandeliers glitter like frozen stars. Rows of polished chairs were already filled with high-profile executives, men and women from some of the world's most powerful housing corporations. Cameras flashed, reporters murmured. The air was heavy with expectation. When Thalia stepped onto the stage, her heart thudded against her ribs. She'd rehearsed this moment for weeks. She knew every slide, every line, every pause. This was her chance to prove herself. She placed her notes on the podium, glanced at the projection screen, and froze. The words staring back at her weren't hers. The opening line, the statistics, even the tone. Everything had been replaced. Worse, it read like a mockery, an amateur's speech that would have turned her into a joke. For a moment her throat closed. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes waiting for her to speak. Her carefully built confidence cracked. A flicker of panic gripped her chest. She looked up, out into the crowd, searching for an anchor, and there he was, Hamin. Sitting among the front rows, calm as ever, his expression steady and unshaken. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat it was as though the noise and the crowd fell away. He tilted his head slightly, then made a small deliberate gesture with his hand, a quiet signal telling her to forget the screen, to focus on the people in front of her. Something in that simple gesture steadied her. Her breathing slowed. Her pulse began to match the rhythm of her steps. Thalia looked back at the audience. She could do this. She didn't need the screen. Most of them didn't know that long before she joined the corporate world, she had been a champion debater in college. Speaking to a room full of strangers wasn't new to her. She had once thrived on it, so she began to speak, not from notes, not from the sabotaged file, but from memory and from the quiet fire that returned to her voice. Her words came alive, fluid, confident, precise. She spoke of innovation, of the future of global housing, of transient's vision and partnerships. Every sentence landed with a sense of purpose. A ripple moved through the audience. Heads nodded. Some executives leaned forward, drawn in by the conviction in her tone. By the time she closed her opening statement, the room felt charged with anticipation. No one in that hall would have believed that she had just improvised the entire speech. And no one missed the way Hamin, in the crowd, allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. Backstage was quieter than the buzzing hall, but Thalia's heart was still beating fast. The adrenaline hadn't yet left her veins. She spotted Hamin standing near the corridor, away from the crowd, watching her with that calm, steady expression she was beginning to recognize. When their eyes met, a different warmth rose in her chest. He smiled as she approached. "Whoa," he said with a soft laugh. "You killed it out there. But why did you freeze at first?" Thalia let out a breath and shook her head. "Someone tampered with the speech," she said quietly. "The file I prepared was replaced. I was staring at words that weren't mine." For a moment, Hamin's jaw tightened, though his voice stayed even. "I figured something was off," he said. "You recovered. Beautifully." Before Thalia could respond, Sion strode up, his expression sharp and businesslike. "Miss Thalia," he began, "you deviated from the approved speech. Yes, you handled the room, but that was not what we agreed on. It's a violation of protocol." Thalia lowered her gaze, ready to defend herself, but before she could speak, Hamin turned to Sion. "She didn't deviate by choice," Hamin said firmly. "Someone tampered with her file. She handled the situation better than anyone else could have. Instead of blaming her, find out who's responsible." Sion hesitated under the weight of Hamin's words, then gave a stiff nod and walked away. Thalia glanced at Hamin, surprised by how readily he had stepped in to protect her. For the first time, she noticed the details she had overlooked before, the way his hair fell slightly into his forehead, the defined line of his jaw, the warmth behind his controlled smile. She looked away quickly, telling herself it was nothing, but it wasn't nothing, and Hamin knew it. As he stood there watching her, he could no longer deny what had been growing in him for weeks. He was falling for her, deeply and irreversibly. Every small smile of hers stayed with him long after he left the office. Every conversation replayed in his mind, but he held himself back. He still had a wife, at least on paper, who, despite being absent for years and clearly living her own life, still demanded the benefits of the contract. It angered him, the way she clung to an arrangement she had long abandoned. That night, as the event wound down and the hall emptied, he called Rian. "Settle it," he said. His voice was low but decisive. "Give Mrs. Thalia everything she's asking for. I'm done dragging this out. I want the divorce finalized. No more excuses." Ryan called them both the next morning. His tone was brisk, but carried a trace of relief. "The paperwork is ready. Come to my office this evening. You can sign, and this whole thing will finally be over." When Thalia ended the call, she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a heartbeat. The weight that had been on her for 3 years was about to lift. She would finally be free. Free from the shadow of a marriage that had never been real, free to move forward, free to let her heart wander where it wanted. A single name rose in her mind like a whisper: Hamin. She caught herself, startled by her own thoughts, and sat up straighter. No, that wasn't an option. Hamin was still a married man, or so she believed, and he was trying to mend that relationship. She forced the thought down and returned to her work. Later that day, as she reviewed schedules at her desk, Hamin stepped into the office. He stood with one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly on the edge of her desk. "Thalia," he said, "add a meeting with my lawyer to my schedule this afternoon. It's at an office building downtown." Thalia blinked. She checked the address and felt her heart skip. "That's strange," she said. "I have a meeting there today, too." Hamin's brows lifted slightly in pleasant surprise. "Well, that's convenient," he said with a faint smile. "We'll go together." I'll take you." The warmth in his voice made her chest tighten unexpectedly. She smiled back, but her tone stayed polite. "Thank you, but I have a few stops to make first. I'll meet you there." "Suit yourself," he said lightly, but the look lingered in his eyes for a moment longer before he turned away. The gentle mood didn't last. Not long after, Sion entered the room, carrying a USB drive and a grim expression. "Sir," he said to Hamin, "we reviewed the CCTV footage. It was Lucina. She accessed the system and swapped the presentation files before the event." Thalia sat straighter at her desk, her lips tightening. Sion's words settled in the air like a lead weight. "Bring her in," Hamin said. Minutes later, Lucina was ushered into the office. Her posture was defensive, chin raised, arms crossed. "Lucina," Hamin said in a controlled voice, "we've seen the footage. You sabotaged Thalia's presentation." "That's a lie," she snapped, her voice high and sharp. "It was AI, some technical glitch. I had nothing to do with it." Hamin's eyes hardened. "Enough. You're fired." The words landed like a gavel, but instead of shrinking, Lucina's anger flared. Her face twisted with contempt as she lashed out. "Of course you'd take her side," she sneered. "You're blinded by whatever she's giving you behind closed doors. You're willing to throw away your judgment for her. She's nothing but a black nobody. And you, stooping this low for her?" For a moment, the room went completely still. Thalia's breath caught in her throat. The insult cut deep, but she refused to let Lucina see her flinch. Hamin's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped a degree colder. "Get out," he said. His tone was quiet but final, leaving no room for further words. Lucina hesitated, but the look in his eyes made her falter. She turned and left, her heels clicking hard against the polished floor. When the door shut, the silence that followed felt almost heavy. Thalia lowered her gaze, fighting to keep her composure. Hamin exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something darker beneath his controlled exterior, then turned back to his desk. Thalia froze. The words that had just come out of Lucina's mouth rang in her ears like a sudden slap. She had always sensed that Lucina disliked her, but she had never imagined that the root of it was something as ugly as racism. And Lucina, in her ignorance, had no idea how far her insult had reached. She thought she was merely belittling Thalia, yet in doing so, she was also throwing the same slur at Hamin himself. Because the wife he had once chosen, even under contract, had been a black woman. Hamin's face hardened, the temperature in the room seeming to drop with it. He said, in a voice that carried the weight of a final verdict, that he had intended only to dismiss Lucina quietly. But now she would not walk away with just a dismissal. She could expect a call from the company's lawyer for tampering with corporate property, and from his own personal lawyer as well, for what she had just said. Thalia stood there watching the scene unfold. Her heart thudded in her chest as she saw Hamin take control, swift and unyielding. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, something deep inside her stirred, as if her heart were calling out to him, reaching for the man behind the authority. But just as quickly, she pushed the feeling down. She reminded herself of the reality. This was the very day they were supposed to finalize their divorce. Neither of them knew, standing there in that tense office, that the day ahead would begin to unravel secrets they weren't ready for. Later, in Rayan's office, Hamin sat opposite his old friend. His posture was composed, but there was a flicker in his eyes, as if he had crossed an invisible threshold. Rayan leaned back in his chair, watching him. "Why the sudden change of heart?" he asked. Hamin's answer came quietly, as if confessing to something he himself hadn't fully grasped until then. "I just want to be done with it," he said. Then, after a brief pause, his voice softened. "To be honest, for the first time in years, I think I'm in love with someone." Rayan stared at him, stunned. Hamin, the man who had once signed a contract marriage with a stranger just to escape family and business pressure. Speaking of love, it was the last thing he had expected to hear. They were still in the middle of their conversation when a soft knock came at the door. Both men looked up as the door opened, and Thalia stepped inside. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. Hamin turned toward her, and their eyes locked. Neither spoke, but their expressions mirrored each other, wary, skeptical, almost defensive. In their minds, thoughts collided in a rush. What is she doing here? Is he stalking me? Did she follow me all the way here? The unspoken questions hung between them, thick and sharp like invisible wires. Then Ryan's voice cut through the silence, snapping them back to the present. "Well," he said with a measured calm, "here she is. You both just need to sign the divorce papers, and that will be it." The room fell still again. The air felt colder, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Thalia and Hamin stared at each other, their shock plain to see. For a long moment, neither could find the words. Finally, Hamin spoke, his voice laced with disbelief. "You mean, she's Thalia, as in Thalia Park? Like my own surname?" He pointed at her, as if needing confirmation that the woman standing there was truly the one he had once married in name only. Thalia didn't answer right away. She was too stunned to speak. All this time, she had never even bothered to know her contract husband's last name. She had signed the marriage papers in a rush, treating it as a mere transaction. When the divorce papers had first started coming in, she had noticed the name, Park, but she hadn't thought much of it. Park was such a common surname in South Korea. It had never crossed her mind that her estranged husband, and the man now staring at her in disbelief, were one and the same. A heavy silence filled the room as the truth began to settle in. Hamin's eyes softened, his mind racing back through every memory, every small encounter that now felt like a piece of a puzzle, finally clicking into place. He remembered the first time they had met, the way she had simply said her name, Thalia. He remembered the restaurant when he had expected to meet another woman, but instead met her again. He remembered her casual remark about the apartment he once visited, that it had been her old building. He remembered her saying she had a meeting in the same office building as his. Scene by scene, it all came together. The woman he had tried so hard to push out of his life was the same woman he had been falling hopelessly in love with all along. Across the room, tears welled in Thalia's eyes. Her heart pounded as the weight of the revelation sank in. How had she not known? How had she never seen it? The silence stretched, until Ryan, still seated behind his desk, cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that tried to sound casual but came out awkward. So, are we still going through with the divorce?" The words seemed to break something inside Hamin. He turned sharply, his voice ringing with a rare, unguarded force. "Never," he said, stepping forward. "Not in this life. Not in the next." He moved toward Thalia, whose tears now rolled freely down her cheeks. For a moment, she stood frozen, as if afraid to believe what she was hearing. Then, as Hamin reached her, something in her heart gave way. She let herself fall into his arms. Ryan sat in stunned silence, his eyes wide at the outburst. But as he watched the two of them clinging to each other, a man and woman who had once been strangers bound by a contract, now reunited by something far deeper, his expression slowly softened. The corners of his mouth lifted into a small, genuine smile. He didn't fully understand how it had all unfolded, or what would come next for them, but in that moment he was simply glad that what had once seemed destined to end in cold paperwork had turned instead into a long-delayed but undeniably beautiful reunion.
And that's the end of today's story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, maybe about the storyline, the characters, a favorite scene, or even the ending. Drop your comments below. I always look forward to reading them. If you'd like to support the channel, please like, share, and subscribe. It really means a lot. I remain Silver, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay well. May God bless you abundantly, and always remember, Silver loves you.